Welcome to CCBC's Political Science Department Speaker Series. My name is John Deedy, Coordinator of Political Science at CCBC Essex. Each year, we invite a variety of people to come to CCBC to discuss political issues and events shaping our community, our state, and our nation. Today, Maryland State Attorney General Doug Gansler will discuss some of these issues and events voters will face in less than a week. Attorney General Gansler is a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law. Prior to becoming Attorney General, and before becoming state's attorney, he served as assistant U.S. attorney, where he personally prosecuted over 1,000 cases. Mr. Gansler served as state attorney for Montgomery County from 1999 to 2007, the largest jurisdiction in the state of Maryland. He is most widely known for leading the Joint Sniper Task Force and successfully prosecuting John Mohammed and Lee Malveaux for the 6 murders they committed in Maryland. He also established the first domestic violence dockets, gang unit, internet crime unit, and elderly abuse task force in Maryland. Mr. Gansler was elected Maryland's Attorney General on November 7, 2006, and was re-elected unopposed in 2010. As Attorney General, Mr. Gansler is focused on environmental, public safety, and consumer issues. Attorney General Gansler is a man, in my opinion, who is really ahead of his time and ahead of the curve on public opinion. In 2007, he endorsed Senator Barack Obama for president when many other state Democrats had endorsed Hillary Clinton. He received the Ally for Equality Award for being the first statewide elected official in Maryland to support marriage equality. As we have recently seen, the role of State Attorney General is critical in the community as an advocate and as a prosecutor. Now it is my honor and pleasure to welcome Maryland State Attorney General Doug Gansler.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, even though it was done in a New York Giants tie, I just noticed. Happy Halloween, everybody. I will try not to make this scary. What I thought I would do is, first of all, correct the record, because we don't want you to be accused of voter suppression. The election actually is not a week from today, but a week from yesterday, which is one of the great things we do as attorneys general around the country. We get all these, a lot of complaints where people will do robocalls saying, don't forget to vote, a week from today, next Wednesday, or other calls that come in an attempt to suppress the vote, where people will say, if you, particularly, we had this in New Mexico, for example, which is a heavy Latino state. If you if you're an illegal immigrant or you know anyone is an illegal immigrant, you can and will be arrested if you go and vote. We've had in other states people robocalls saying, if you owe back child support or tickets, and you go to vote, you will be arrested. So that was a voter suppression effort, but we switched it till next Tuesday. So thank you for having me being here. What I thought I would do is just talk about the 4 issues that I think are most interesting on the Maryland ballot in 6 days, and then talk about whatever you want. I do questions, and I'll try and give some answers. The 4 ballot questions that are most interesting and out there, I guess I'll start with what was mentioned in the introduction, which is marriage equality. That's an issue that I've obviously been very in front on, and believing that the prohibition against marriage equality violates the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. My view is that everybody has the right to health, happiness, and in health, happiness, and the pursuit of liberty, or whatever it is. I can't remember right now. I'm tired. But it was a rough few days. But in any event, we should have marriage equality in Maryland. We passed it in, I wrote an opinion in March of 2010 recognizing out-of-state same-sex marriages here in Maryland from the 6 states that have same-sex marriage, as well as D.C., that we would recognize it. Our statute and our laws are silent as to whether or not we recognize out-of-state same-sex marriages, and now we fixed that through the Attorney General opinion. The legislature finally passed a law saying we would allow same-sex marriage here in Maryland. Right now, up to that point, the statute said marriage was between a man and a woman. The question is whether or not that should be upheld by the voters of Maryland on Tuesday. Regardless of whether it's upheld on Tuesday or not, we will eventually have same-sex marriage here in Maryland. We'll have it around the country, because as courts are increasingly recognizing, it does violate the Constitution not to allow same-sex couples to get married. But we hope to be the first state that does, where people actually go to the ballot and vote in favor of same-sex marriage. The polls have it up, 15 to 20 points, depending on which polls you look at. Of course, many people are unwilling on a phone interview to say, no, I'm kind of narrow-minded. I don't think people who are homosexuals should get the same rights that I do. But they might do that in a voting booth. So people are still concerned with where that ends up. And also who turns out, because there's a huge cross current of people that are turning out or expected to turn out on Tuesday, and particularly demographic and geographic diversity. In other words, there's expected, the only real race of any sort of import, if you look at it on the statewide, is the 6th congressional district, which is Western Maryland. And some people would argue that the people in Western Maryland aren't maybe as progressive voting as, say, Baltimore City, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, or other parts of the state. There's also some who would suggest that the African American community might be a place where same-sex marriage isn't as endorsed by, in particular, the pastors might not be as in favor of it, with a large population of African Americans coming out to vote for Barack Obama. That may not bode well for marriage equality and the DREAM Act and some other issues. So that's sort of something to look at in the overview. So marriage equality will be an interesting issue on the ballot this year. If it's passed, it becomes the law that we will have same-sex couples allowed to get married in Maryland. If it doesn't pass, we'll revert back to the old law, which is marriages between a man and a woman in Maryland, and then that would be challenged in the Court of Appeals and ultimately found in the Court of Appeals of Maryland to be unconstitutional anyway. Second issue on the ballot is the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act is interesting. If people knew what the DREAM Act was, it would pass overwhelmingly, but most people don't know what it is. I thought that the DREAM Act, if you had asked me 6 months ago, I thought the DREAM Act would be the one that would be most unlikely to succeed, because people think it's giving illegal aliens free spots at the University of Maryland to take their kids' spots at the University of Maryland. What it actually is the DREAM Act allows for families, for children who came here with families perhaps illegally, though they have no culpability themselves, where so they came here when they were children, their parents have been paying taxes, they've graduated from a public school in Maryland, and now want to get in-state tuition at a community college like Essex. And then they'll be allowed after a couple years to then apply to a 4-year university. So most people, if they knew about what it is, it really wouldn't affect many people. It would affect more like hundreds of people rather than thousands of people in the state of Maryland. But many people view it as a first step toward where we ultimately need to go in immigration, which is finding a way to assimilate the 12 million illegal aliens here into the state of Maryland and the United States. So the DREAM Act is actually polling ahead of all of the ballot issues, which is somewhat, I find, interesting, but we'll see how that also works at the ballot box. Our Latino vote, which is who the DREAM Act most affects, albeit affecting a lot of immigrant communities, is not a huge proportion of the expected turnout on Tuesday. So we'll see where that goes. The third issue is redistricting. And the redistricting is interesting because I actually have to defend the legislature in its drawings of the map. We did that. It is what the legislature did and the governor did in redistricting is clearly legal, and the courts have so held. So we've actually gotten past that barrier. The question is, just because it's legal, does it mean it's right? And so many people have a problem with the way in which the state was gerrymandered this last time. For example, in the 6th district, which I already mentioned, Garrett County, Maryland, a very rural, agrarian part of the state, is coupled with Potomac, Maryland, in Montgomery County, which is perhaps the most wealthy and least agrarian part of the state. And yet, though they are voting for the same representative in the election between Roscoe Bartlett, a longtime congressman, and John Delaney, sort of a newcomer on the political scene. Another district that people are a little bit concerned about is a district I believe John Sarbanes represents currently, which has parts of Baltimore City combined with only Maryland, which is in Montgomery County. And the question there is, can the same representative reflect the mores and views of those two different parts of the state? So what happened, we have 8 congressional districts. At one point it was 4, not too long in the past. Actually, I think when I started this, getting into politics in the late 90s, it was 4-4 Democrat to Republican. It then went to 6-2 Democrat to Republican. It then went to 7-1 when Frank Cradaville won in the 1st district on the Eastern Shore. The Democrats had the ability, and I can say the Democrats, I'm not part of this process of the drawing of the lines. The Democrats had the ability to look at the state gerrymandered in such a way to make it 7-1. They did, after Frank Cradaville lost to Andy Harris, they were looking, do they want to make the Eastern Shore, try that again to make it even more Democratic and make that the 7th Democratic district, or Western Maryland. They chose Western Maryland, and it's actually a 53% Democratic district, but again, many parts of Western Maryland are a little more conservative even for the Democrats. So that'll be an interesting issue to see where that goes and if people really are focused on it. And but the long shot of that is, even if it gets overturned, the Democratic legislature will just go back in January, redraw the lines, and they can draw essentially the same lines again. So, and they may do that, they may choose to do it differently. The final issue is I would argue, the most confusing. And I would argue it's the most confusing for 2 reasons, and this is the gambling issue. The first issue is, the reason why it's confusing is there's $45 million worth of truthful / misleading ads on the subject, which is sort of confusing a lot of people as to where they should vote on that particular issue. The second was the way in which the question was brought to the ballot, and that is there's 2 different components of the gambling issue. One is, do we expand table gaming? Right now we have slots in the 5 casinos that are in Maryland, or proposed casinos, only slot machines, people sticking quarters into machines. What they want to do on this ballot initiative is to expand that to include table gaming, poker, blackjack, and the like, at all the existing casinos. On the same question is the issue of whether to build a new casino in Prince George's County. People speculate it would be somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion. So what you might find, many would submit, is that people in Prince George's County will be voting predominantly, and that's a big part of the electorate, by the way. The people in Prince George's County will be voting predominantly on the issue as to whether or not to build a new casino at the National Harbor, while the rest of the state really couldn't care less whether they build a new casino in Prince George's County, and are going to be voting on whether or not to expand table gaming. And so it's an interesting issue because people have different motives, either yay or nay, on 2 different issues tied into the same ballot. And the final piece of that I should mention is, if it passes, so people vote in favor of that question, I think it's question 7, then Prince George's still isn't going to build the casino unless Prince George's, the county itself, votes in favor of that referendum issue. So those are the 4 major issues. People will be going to the ballot box, some of which people will be going just on one of those 4 issues because they care so much one way or the other on those issues. The thinking is that Barack Obama will win overwhelmingly in Maryland. We're perhaps the most Democratic state in the United States now, and if he weren't to win in Maryland, then he's going to be in big trouble. So there's a less of an incentive for people to go out and vote because there's really no elections in terms of candidates that are at issue other than that 6th district, which is Western Maryland. So people may just go out to vote on that single issue that they may have a concern about. So those are the things I think to look forward to on Tuesday. My office, the role of my office, we do represent the State Board of Elections, and we also represent the people of Maryland. So we're going to be very involved, as we always are, on the issue of voter fraud and stay on top of that and make sure that there's no voter suppression issues don't come to the fore or any voter fraud occurs on Tuesday. With that, I will subside and take any questions or get any comments that you might have. Yes?
Now, you said on question 7 is for gambling and casinos and stuff, and it says on the ads that it's going to be taking money from education, and then other people saying it's not. So what is it? If it's going to take money from education, how much?
What they say, the ads, I believe, or the proponents say, is that it's actually going to give, that the money that's going to be gained from the casinos will be used for a dedicated education fund. So other people say that's not true because the General Assembly has no restrictions on using that money. They can raid that fund and would raid that fund at any time that they needed money for a different project or for a different source than education. So it's a little, I mean, I think the intention is certainly stated, and the legislative intent is that the money taken from casinos will be used for education. Now, you have to bear in mind that a lot of the money is coming from poor people. Many would argue most of the money comes from poor people, and that the reason why they're putting $45 million of ads into this is because the casino owners are the ones that actually profit. So the people who are against it say, well, this is just taxing poor people, giving money to casino owners, and some of the residual may be used for education. The other people that are in favor of it talk about jobs, that there'll be jobs created in terms of the building of the casino and then the operation of the casino. Others, though, on that same sort of economic issue and education issue would argue that it doesn't make economic sense for the state at all. In other words, the state condoned 5 casinos. 2 of them aren't even up and running yet at this point, and that there's a zero-sum game of the amount of people who would actually stick quarters in slot machines. For example, I've never put a quarter in a slot machine in my life. And there are a lot of people that feel that same way, that wouldn't do it. They know the odds are against them. That's what the casinos are there for, to make money. And so, for example, when Arundel Live opened, the one in Anne Arundel County opened, almost immediately the one in Perryville went bankrupt, because there's only so many people that are going to gamble in the state of Maryland. And so people would argue, well, let's, perhaps the state's already saturated by putting yet a 6th casino there. Is there going to be money left for to put into an education fund or not? Yeah. And these are issues that some people would say, well, we should wait a little while, see how the 5 we have prosper, and if there's a need for a 6th. Go ahead.
I understand what you're saying, but that it's like voting for something that has no guarantee on what's going to happen with our future or the future of our children is something that I'm concerned about. I mean, because I decided to come back to college to get to better myself with a different education. But with this going in place and stuff, and then putting this question out to people, and then you get mixed messages from it, it really doesn't make me want to vote yes for it. It makes me want to vote no.
Well, if you're voting solely on the issue of whether or not gambling money will be used for education, I mean, everyone's got to make their own decision and read their own literature. If that were your only concern, then perhaps it would be a good thing, because they intend to use the money for education, so it's more likely that that would be a dedicated fund. That said, I would argue the state is actually worse off with yet a 6th casino economically in the long term. We would then have less money to spend on what is a state priority and always has been, which is education. So it's a tough, this is why I saved it for last, that issue when I was presenting the 4. It is very confusing and just pregnant with uncertainty about whether it's good, bad, or indifferent in terms of the future. Yeah?
With the heritage of the word marriage being deeply rooted in religions, why hasn't legislature pushed for constitutional equality for homosexual unions as to not step on the toes of religious freedoms?
Why, for example, why doesn't the legislature have pushed for civil unions kind of?
Why are they using the word marriage?
Why are they using the word marriage?
Rather than civil union equality?
Yeah.
That term marriage has roots to holy matrimony, which pushes really into a lot of religions.
Right. Well, I'm not in the legislature, so you'd have to ask them. But I can tell you the argument that I would make is that this is an issue where church and state got blended 400 years ago in England. And so many would argue that, and sort of this is the ultimate concept here, is that you should get your marriage license. It's a contract between two people to do what they want. And then the particular religious service has a religious overtone, a deep religious significance to many people, and that the churches or mosques or synagogues that want to marry people can, and if they don't want to, they don't have to, and they have that, and that's actually constitutionally protected. And to make it even more so, which was unnecessary verbiage, but they still put it in the statute anyway, it's protected actually in the law itself, saying that no religious institution would have to marry same-sex couples. The reason why same-sex couples think is important is because they think that they are entitled to the same rights of citizenship as everybody else, that they've been denied that, and that there is no cogent argument against allowing same-sex couples to get married. Some of them that have been brought have been, for example, well, it's against the Bible that says that you shouldn't have same-sex marriage, and then the other side of that is that nowhere in the Bible is marriage equality or same-sex marriage mentioned, though being tolerant and allowing God to judge is in there. That somehow if two gay people get married that live 3 blocks away from me or something, that'll somehow undermine my marriage, and there's really no evidence to that being the case. Or that they'll start teaching it in the schools and so forth. See, the problem is the argument that I've talked to many people about this issue, and what it ends up occurring is there's a belief amongst those who are against marriage equality for others that you somehow wake up one day and choose to be gay. They don't realize that you are born gay. And so to deny somebody the rights of every other American citizen, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because of the way in which they're born, or the way the religion that they might have, or the skin color that they might have, is a denial of the fundamental freedoms that we hold very dearly in this country. So those are the arguments why they didn't do it. So they thought civil marriage would be, it'd be like saying to a Jewish person, an Episcopalian person, you know what, we're actually not going to let you get married, but we'll let you have something called a civil marriage. You're not going to get to be like the people next door, but you can be something, sort of get halfway there, or blacks and whites before the Loving case in 1968 in the Supreme Court. So those are the arguments that they make. Yeah?
Are you saying that no matter how the vote comes out, that because it's in the Constitution, the right of liberty and pursuit of happiness for everyone, that it will happen anyway?
Yeah, I mean, the marriage equality issue is the fastest growing social issue in the history of the United States. No issue has moved this fast. I mean, it took them 200 and something years to change the Second Amendment from being a collective right to an individual right. I mean, you can't see a movement that has gone. 10 years ago, the idea that same-sex couples would be married in this country would just be, you think we're talking about UFOs. 10 years from now, I do believe, way less than that every state will allow same-sex couples to get married. What I'm saying is the courts that have looked at this and decided this in recent years universally have held that the denial of two people to get married, whether or not they're regardless of their sexual orientation, it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. And so courts, even if it doesn't pass, somebody will challenge it, and this court in Maryland, the Court of Appeals, will overturn it and say, no, saying marriage is only between a man and a woman is unconstitutional, because all the other courts have decided, and that actually makes sense. And so I think that'll be where it ultimately will be decided. And the Supreme Court has actually, will probably take this, a Ninth Circuit case from California, and overturn what they call the Defense of Marriage Act, which is the federal equivalent, as being violating of the Equal Protection Clause. That doesn't mean people are in favor of it or against it. I just believe that's where the courts are going. It's an interesting issue, sort of politically and demographically. Most, not all, but most people under 40 don't even understand why the grown-ups are talking about this. Of course, gay people can get married. What do I care? And then a lot of people over 40 have a problem with sort of the visual of it and think that's just not what I'm used to. And Democrat, Republican really hasn't, I mean, in some ways it's a very Republican issue. Two people contract to do whatever they want, leave the government out of their private lives. Yet somebody's told a lot of the Republicans are supposed to be against it for some reason. It's a really interesting social phenomenon meets politics to watch it evolve over in the various states. Yes, sir.
Well, this is a little off topic, but do you believe that influence of money in politics is a problem?
Yes. The influence of money in politics is a huge problem. I mean, look at this question 7. It's spinning people all over the place. It's because Citizens United was wrongly decided by the Supreme Court. And so what's happening now is just millions and millions of dollars of special interests are getting pumped in to elections all over the United States. Not candidates expressing their views, but the corporate interests or other interests are expressing their views, and it has a huge influence in terms of messaging and, you know, slick ads and that kind of thing. I think it's horrible. I think it's a horrible thing. I don't think money is speech, though the Supreme Court does. I would disagree with them on that. And then there's a lot of artificial boundaries. For example, in Maryland, you're just using Maryland as an example, any special interests, oil industry, insurance industry companies, whoever, can come in and spend millions and millions of dollars under the guise of being free speech and not tell you where the money's coming from, by the way. And a candidate is limited to $4,000 per person. So candidates can't even counter that, even if they had the ability to, counter the messaging from these huge special interests. I do think it's a problem. You know, it'd be great if everybody had public financing, but then everyone would have to agree at the same time. And the problem, of course, is the people that are voting on those laws have benefited from not having public financing. That's how they got there in the first place. And, you know, I put together a campaign finance reform committee, bipartisan. We had 27 recommendations for the state of Maryland. A few of them have passed, many have not. But you know, so we hopefully we'll get campaign finance reform. But Citizens United changed the entire landscape of how money will influence politics in the future.
On that, the Supreme Court has said, yes, it's okay with these super PACs, right?
Yes.
Is there any way then that can ever be rescinded?
Yes, the Supreme Court could rescind it, and they could certainly limit it and scale it back. Many people think the Supreme Court did not realize the magnitude of the ramifications of that law, Citizens United, and what it would do to turn the entire our political system topsy-turvy, and that they have some misgivings about it. It was a 5-4 decision, I believe, when it was passed. So there certainly can be revisited either directly or contextually. I mean, most often when the Supreme Court looks at cases, when they take the cases on cert, they are looking at a slightly different issue, and they can curtail their earlier opinions or, you know, change it in some way. Or they can, it's happened, it doesn't happen a lot, but they can completely overturn a previous decision.
Is there any way now of knowing if other countries are contributing to these super PACs?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't think they are, and I don't know why that is. I think you have to be an American company, but I don't know the answer to that. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Everybody happy? Yes.
I'll raise one that we kind of talked about at the beginning, which is, how do you feel about the issue, and this has creeped up along the lines of voter suppression, is voter identification laws, where basically states are now mandating that you have to present an ID in order to vote. How do you feel about that, whereas Maryland, if they're looking to do that, et cetera? Because I think a lot of people don't understand the ramifications, pro and con each way.
Yeah, voter ID laws are not likely to happen in Maryland. Again, we're a very democratic state, and the prevailing thinking is that voter ID laws help Republicans and hurt Democrats. They hurt Democrats because the people who don't typically have state identification are poor or are minorities, and poorer people and minorities are more likely to vote for Democrats. That's the prevailing thought. One of the interesting things I found about the voter ID dialogue is casting light on how many people don't have identification. Most people didn't realize there's 21 million Americans don't have a form of identification. I certainly was unaware of the huge numbers of folks that didn't have identification. Now, the criticism of voter ID laws is not only you disenfranchising people from the right to vote, but you're also, that's a solution in search of a problem. In other words, they haven't found widespread numbers of people who are trying to vote multiple times and not using an ID. So I don't think I certainly don't think it's going to happen in Maryland, and the Supreme Court will ultimately have to rule on whether or not it's something that is allowed or not allowed. But it's a big problem. I mean, it's a big problem in places that do have it. I mean, when I vote, they do ask me for my identification in Maryland. It's kind of interesting, the place I go, and you actually don't have to show it, but they ask for it anyway. But most people don't realize you don't have to show it, and they should not be turned away. And we're really unaware of any cases where people have been turned away for lack of identification.
Of the 21 million who don't have identification in the United States, would the 12 million that are here illegally be part of that 21 million?
Not necessarily, but many people would be. Many people that are here illegally do have state documents. They have driver's licenses, for example, which will allow you to vote. So there's not a direct correlation between illegal immigrants and those who don't have voter ID. Most of the people that don't have voter ID or have a state identification actually tend to be older and are minorities and poorer folks. They just don't have a reason. They just don't drive. And if you don't drive, if you don't have a driver's license, most people don't have a picture ID, a valid state-sponsored picture ID that's not a driver's license. Some do, but most people don't. So if you don't drive a car and have a license to do so, you're more likely not to have identification than you would be to have it, frankly. Let me get to different, yeah.
Sorry, one more about the redistricting.
Yeah.
You said that if that is not voted in, then it will happen anyway because they'll bring it up again.
Well, not necessarily the exact same map, but it'd be a similar map, yeah.
But why is it even brought up then if it's, the people's vote doesn't really?
Well, there's a particular delegate that sort of started this whole, we haven't had referendum like this in Maryland in 18 years. This is kind of a new concept. And from somebody, I majored in political science, it's an interesting issue. Should you have referendum? In other words, you elect people to represent you and your views and the views of your neighborhood through the delegates and the state senators, and they're supposed to go and vote on things. And in this case, they voted on how they voted in the sense they drew the lines on how the map should look. And now you're putting it to the people of Maryland to vote on these issues that I mentioned. And is that a better form of government? Or where do you draw the line on how many things people are going to vote on, and then how many special interests you're going to allow in to have ads on TV and sort of try and push the vote one way or the other? In this case, though, on redistricting, somebody, I think it was a Republican delegate named Parrott, went around and got signatures to say, let's put this on the ballot, let the people vote. Most people don't realize that the remedy for, if they vote yes, if it gets upheld, then these are the lines from now until 2020. If they vote down, because every 10 years they redistrict, and if it gets voted down, then the next legislative session, they'll redo the lines, but there's no requirement that they redo them substantially different than they have them now, because the lines that they drew are legal, and the courts have upheld them as being such. So it's more like kind of voicing your view that we just don't think this is a good thing for people to do. Maybe the sort of looking optimistically, you vote the lines down, you vote the redistricting down, and you're sending a message to the legislature that, hey, you guys, you really should pay attention to, Western Maryland should be a district. Baltimore should be a district. Think people that have similar geographic interests should be aligned together in congressional districts. They don't have to listen to you, but they might. Yes, sir.
So I had the same question. Just want you to elaborate on a little bit more on the district. What's the advantage and disadvantage of the voters?
Of the what? Of the voters? Well, if you are, let's say you live in Garrett County or Allegheny County, Western Maryland, and your big concern is how much you, Mr. Congressman or Mrs. Congressman, are going to get us for agricultural grants or open space, or the reasons why people choose to live in much more rural areas, their vote will be diluted, their ability to get that will be diluted greatly by people in Potomac, Maryland, who care about, maybe not care about their corn, because there's no corn being grown in Potomac, Maryland, but care about, a new school or upgrading their school, whatever the issue might be. Not that people in Western Maryland don't care about schools, they do. But, priorities are certainly different between people that live in Potomac, Maryland. I think it's the richest, it might be the richest zip code in America. It's certainly one of them. And Western Maryland, Garrett County, which is not one of the richest zip codes in America, and is very, agriculturally based. So that's what's the disadvantage. That's why people should care. The other side of the coin is, why should people care? Well, we're a Democratic state. It's better to have, look at these Tea Party guys running amok in Washington. We in Maryland can make a difference by having 7 Democrats and only 1 Republican versus 6 Democrats and 2 Republicans, or 5 and 3, however you might want to carve it up. And, the reason why it all happens in the first place is the Supreme Court has upheld the system of gerrymandering. They often overturn specific cases, but it's legal. What they're doing is legal, and there really is to the victor go the spoils. So what's happening in Maryland is, yes, it's a Democratic state, so they draw the lines to help Democrats. In Utah, which is a Republican state, they draw the lines to help the Republicans. And so maybe it's a zero-sum game in the end. That's sort of the thinking on all this. All right, well, there's no other questions. Thank you all for being here, and don't forget to vote however you want. I hope this was somewhat illuminating and helpful, and we'll see you next time.